Hello and welcome to Nighttime Stories with Jeremiah, the only place where our nighttime stories won't put you to sleep. Hopefully. Today's nighttime story covers something very near and dear to my heart: leprosy, and namely medieval leprosy. Today we'll be covering the story of crusaders with leprosy, medieval Arabics with leprosy, King Baldwin IV, probably one of the most famous lepers of all time, and finally, how the two cultures exchanged treatment and diagnosis of leprosy during the Crusades. But first, a little about leprosy. Leprosy in the Middle Ages was not a medical diagnosis as we think of it today. Leprosy then typically contained any and all skin diseases, things that included, like leprosy, rashes, and eczema. A great example of this would be the argument of whether leprosy also covered a diagnosis of syphilis, which is a view that is held by several prominent historians, such as Charles Derenberg, Karl Sudhoff, and Charles Singer. This view is directly opposed by Luc Nemeter in his article on the description and diagnosis of leprosy by 14th century historians, and several other prominent historians, namely Nancy Siriossi and Claude Thomaset. The fact that this is even a debate shows just how wide of a scope that medieval leprosy covered. On the other hand, today, leprosy is a very specific medical diagnosis, which is also known as Hansen's disease. In an article written on leprosy in the 21st century, Cassandra White, an anthropologist from Georgia Tech University, discusses how Hansen's disease is very easily treated by antibiotics, and in many developed countries is not even at risk. However, it still remains a fairly large issue in underdeveloped countries and in many other places in the world. Dr. White also discusses how leprosy has a very low contagion rate, and it often takes multiple, prolonged exposures in order to contract it. Hansen's disease mainly works by attacking the peripheral nerve cells. Think any cells that aren't attached to the spinal cord or the brain. This often leaves people with untreated leprosy being unable to feel anything in many areas of their body. The bacteria that is the cause of leprosy, Mycobacteria leprobacillus, also often attacks the skin, leaving many who have chronic Hansen's disease to develop lesions that fester and don't heal properly. If you don't want to see a picture of leprosy, please look away now. Now, you may be wondering, why did he spend so much time on modern leprosy when this is a video about historical leprosy? Well, that's because I want you to understand the attitude and treatment of lepers in medieval society and why they were so scared of the disease. This is the worst case option. Now, some final quick facts about leprosy before we move on. Leprosy, again, is very easily treated with antibiotics today. It can also be carried by red squirrels, armadillos, and Hawaii once held many of the leper colonies that were started and used by the United States. So now, let me tell you the story of crusaders and leprosy. Crusader leprosy often boggles the modern mind when it is discussed. Today, we often look for the perfect diagnosis. I want to know what I have, how I got it, and how to treat it. This was not possible during the Crusades, which means that medieval theories on where leprosy came from, how you got it, and the treatment for it varied significantly. Bernard Gordon, a 14th century physician, wrote a medieval journal of medicine called Lilium Medicinae, which in it he claims that leprosy has multiple sources. And I quote, "Leprosy is either introduced from within the uterus or after birth. If from within the uterus, it is because of conception at the time of menstruation, or because it is the child of a leper, or because a leper has had intercourse with a pregnant woman, and thus the baby will be leprous. For leprosy is generated out of these great corruptions that befall conception." He also claims that if it should happen after birth, this can be because the air is bad, corrupted and pestilential, and because of prolonged use of melancholic foods, such as lentils and other legumes. And from such melancholic meats as that of foxes, bears, wild boars, hares, and other quadrupeds, such as asses and the like. Since in some regions all wild animals are eaten, leprosy also arises from too much company with lepers and from lying with a leprous woman. So, even within the same medical journal, you see several different explanations as for where the leprosy comes from. Treatment of leprosy was also very different. There was no guaranteed cure from the disease before antibiotics, and let me tell you, there are some absolutely wild cures. In fact, in an article written on leprosy in ancient and early medieval times, historian Harold Snellgrove writes of several cures found in medieval medical literature, which included black sulfur mixed with oil, burned fish ash and elephant skin, bloodletting mixed with forcible excretion of the bowels, immediately followed by running, sweating, and eating very little food. Or you could also take native soda, honey, and ox intestine combined together. Oh, and my personal favorite, cooked vipers mixed with a sauce of oil, water, warts, and aneth, which is dill, like for your pickles. I told you, there were some absolutely wild cures. Having leprosy during the Crusader period also meant social consequences as well as physical. In the same article written by Dr. Snellgrove, lepers were often cast out of the city for fear of contamination and spread of the disease. In some cases, like France, laws were passed that forbid the mingling of lepers with other people. However, just because you were outcast, or some cities prevented the mingling with you with other lepers, you weren't entirely separated from civilized society. In fact, many churches began running leper houses, or leprosariums, that would house the lepers and provide food, clothes, and religious meetings. These leprosariums would be stationed just outside of the city or attached to the city wall. In an article written by historians Timothy Miller and Rachel Smith Savage, they outline how lepers were often seen as a group of people that required special giving and care given to them from Christians. They show that bishops were often required to set aside special rations for lepers in their towns, and that the lepers should be allowed to come into and leave the leprosariums as they wish, and that giving to lepers and the care of lepers was seen as one of the chief acts of charity that one could perform. Now, let's talk about one of the most famous lepers of all time, King Baldwin IV. He is an interesting case study into what happens when a nobleman contracts the disease. Baldwin IV had leprosy since he was a child. However, it was often hidden from others in order to preserve the strength of his rule in Jerusalem. Baldwin IV's biggest accomplishment while king was defeating Saladin, one of the greatest generals of all time, as a 16-year-old on the battlefield. Unfortunately, he was not able to accomplish much afterwards, other than trying to keep his rule together, as this was a period of time in which he was often fighting to preserve his family's hold on the rule in Jerusalem. The role that Baldwin IV played in the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem is often overstated, especially by movies like Kingdom of Heaven. However, what is interesting is how he was able to rule for most of the time that he was alive. He fought to hide the disease, which is why he was often wearing a mask to cover his face. He was also able to be very politically active while still trying to be withdrawn from the public eye. In fact, he was the kind of ruler who understood the political faction in his kingdoms and was able to make good use of it for a time. However, even kings faced the effects of the disease. Towards the end of his life, he appointed his brother-in-law, Guy of Lusignan, who was a terrible ruler. He eventually replaced him with Raymond III of Tripoli, who ruled it in his stead until the death of Baldwin IV. His son soon took over his rule, and then his son died, which meant that Guy came back, who many scholars point to as weakening the Crusader kingdoms and led to their eventual downfall. Now, let me tell you the story of Arabic lepers. There are many similarities in the treatment of lepers between Arabic nations and Crusader kingdoms. Historian Michael Dawes wrote several articles discussing the treatment of lepers in Arabic society, namely Leprosy in Medieval Arabic Medicine and Leprosy in Medieval Arabic Society. In these articles, he explains that Arabic nations had been dealing with leprosy for a much longer time than those of the Crusaders. It was a very common illness in the region since the beginning of recorded history, whereas on the other hand, leprosy within the European kingdoms would come and go periodically. The diagnosis of leprosy was one of those similarities. The examination for skin lesions and common skin disease symptoms often was what led to people being diagnosed with leprosy. One difference is that Arabic lepers were often identified earlier, as Arabic medicine had what was called the malady of the lion, which was how you told for leprosy, because of the effects on the hair and voice that would come from the disease. Treatment was also very similar in the fact that it varied widely, with many options such as bloodletting being a very common treatment, while the disease was early set. Also included wine, which had previously had a venomous viper submerged into it, which is an interesting shared treatment, at least in the form of the venomous viper. They must have had a thing for those. What is very different is how the Arabic nations believed that leprosy was spread. Many saw it as contagious, but not a big issue to be focusing on. And instead, the focus was on many theories, such as how an excess of bile in the blood or a deformed liver could possibly have been the cause of the leprosy. This leads to a marked shift in how Islamic lepers were treated in society. Instead of being cast out and forced not to be around other people, they were allowed to be a part of their society and were kept in normal areas and treated by physicians like any other sickness. This is attributed to, by Michael Dawes, to the fact that Arabic society had much more exposure and experience with lepers than those in the Crusader kingdoms. Lepers in medieval Arabic society were allowed to stay a part of society, but with limited rights. They were treated as disabled, and so had the same kinds of rights as the minor, the bankrupt, the insane, and the slave. In many cases, lepers were treated closer to the mentally ill, particularly in issues pertaining divorce and marriage, which in many cases meant that the leper would have to leave their wives and live separately away from them. Now that I've told you the story of Crusader and Arabic leprosy, let me tell you the story of their interactions. During the Crusades, many ideas were shared across cultural lines between the European Crusaders and medieval Arabic society. These included things like architecture, warfare, technology, and medicine all being shared. The treatment of leprosy being shared isn't directly stated by either side as being gained from their interaction. However, what can be seen is how treatments and diagnosis of leprosy changed after the Crusades on both sides of the conflict. One of the largest changes was the start of the Arabic use of leprosariums. After the Crusades, according to Michael Dawes, use of leprosariums and total exclusion from society was very common, which hadn't been very common beforehand. On the other hand, the European Crusaders were exposed again to many ancient Greek and Roman texts that otherwise had been lost to them. The amount of exclusion also changed for European lepers. Adopting some of the freedoms that lepers in Arabic society had, the leprosariums were altered and allowing for more freedom for leper movement, and they were generally given more freedom to be a part of society. Another shared treatment between cultures was the use of what was called Saracen ointment. Essentially an ointment made with mercury. Used to rub on the affected skin, it was often carried back with returning crusaders and was given to leprosariums to aid those helping treat those within. Leprosy during the Crusader period was treated in many ways, often depending on where you lived. Whether you're a European Crusader, Arabic warrior, leprosy affected your health and social status. The treatments and diagnosis of leprosy changed during the Crusades in large part to the exposure of cultures. Arabic medicine and European leprosariums crossed cultural lines and highlighted how cultural exchange happened during the Crusades, even while the two cultures were at war. I'm Jeremiah, and this has been your nighttime story.